Good evening, everyone, on a very, very cold day of the new year, and a very, very happy new year to all of you. Though I don't know, this COVID has really, entered the new year, but maybe this COVID will take away all the previous COVIDs. It will be COVID free after this year, hopefully so. So this is the first meeting of the 2022 and is being held by the Gangaram Hospital. And before we start the meeting, uh, we will have the secretary's report as usual. And I think since after the conference, we only had very few events. And besides, the one good thing we had was the valedictory function after a very long time. That was great fun. So I hand over to Anita, a joint secretary, for the secretary's report. Anita, over to you. Anita, are you there?
Anita ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and happy new year to everyone. So let me share my screen. I'm not able to share. Okay. I don't know. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it is. Isko full screen kar lo.
Okay. Is it visible, ma'am?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay. So good afternoon and happy new year to everyone. So I start with the secretary's report. So first we start with we had a AOGD monthly clinical meeting which was held in MAMC and LNJP on 3rd of December. Next we had AOGD valedictory on 4th of December. Then we had a camp done in collaboration with Rotary Club, Vasant Kunj and Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Hospital under the aegis of AOGD on 5th of December. A PG forum was conducted on 20th of December, Diabetes in Pregnancy by Lady Harding Medical College and Vardhaman Mahavir Medical College and Safdarjung Hospital. A PPIUCD training in private sector by Foxy Family Welfare Committee in association with AOGD was conducted on 9th and 10th of December. A multidisciplinary approach for chronic pelvic pain. A webinar was conducted by AOGD in association with FEPA 30th of December. We had a fetal medicine subcommittee webinar, current update in screening for Down syndrome, obstetrician perspective on 6th of January. There was a recent book launch and recent advances in gynae and in Berks and Novex gynecology, which was held on 23rd of December. Speaker for this webinar were Dr. A.G. Radhika and Dr. Rashmi, and guest of feminine were Dr. Geet. We had a AOGD bulletin launch. So these were the now the forthcoming events. We have a PG forum planned on 17th of January and CME by endometriosis committee 21st of January, CME by endoscopy committee 27th of January, CME by oncology committee 29th of January. And the next AOGD monthly clinical meeting will be held at Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital on 28th of January. So hand over to Dr. Achla Batra ma'am.
Thank you, Anita. And I request everyone that after the clinical meeting is over, we have a very, very important GBM in which the agenda is about the constitution amendment and the forthcoming elections. The third agenda of passing of the audit report of Gangaram will not be able to do it because the report got delayed and we've not been able to circulate to everyone. So we'll have it in the next GBM. So over to you, Dr. Gujral, for starting the proceedings of the meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Achla, and a very good evening to all AOGians. I start by wishing each one of you a very healthy, happy, prosperous New Year, and of course, as Achla said, a COVID-free New Year. So we have 4 cases lined up. The first case is of non-puberal uterine inversion, laparoscopic management, which will be dealt by Dr. Mamta. Hyperreactive lutalis in pregnancy, management challenge by Dr. Geeta and Sarmishta, misplaced IUCD in urinary bladder by Dr. Renuka, and a torted endometrioma with large uterine fibroid in a 54-year-old woman by Dr. Kanika. I invite the first speaker, Dr. Mamta, and first speaker will invite the second one, second, third one, and third one, fourth one. Thank you. Mamta, all yours.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, and good evening, everyone. No, I will. Can you share? Can you see my screen?
Not as yet.
Can you see my screen, ma'am?
It has just
No.
started. You have it's yet to open.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. Good evening.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I shall be presenting this case of I shall be presenting this case. She was a 41-year-old lady, Lieutenant Colonel, resident of Bareilly, who presented with some mass coming per vaginum since last 3 months, and it was associated with irregular and heavy vaginal bleeding. She suddenly noticed this mass when she was doing yoga Surya Namaskar, and it was a painless, dragging kind of a sensation when she first noticed it. There was a history of irregular heavy bleeding per vaginum on and off for last 3 months with associated vaginal discharge. And in view of severe anemia due to heavy blood loss, she was transfused 8 units of blood transfusion in last 3 months as her hemoglobin fell down from 3 to 5. She was diagnosed fibroid polyp on ultrasound 14 months back during her routine medical checkup. Her menstrual cycles, she had a history of heavy menstrual bleeding, 6 to 7 by 10, 15 to 20 days cycle over last 2 years. Before that, her cycles were regular. She was para 2 with both vaginal deliveries 14 and 11 years back. And there was past history of hypothyroidism for last 3 years, and she was on medication, Thironol, and her thyroid was controlled. Besides it, there was no significant past personal history or a family history. With a weight of 60 and height 150, she had a BMI of 26.7. Her general physical examination was unremarkable. Cardiovascular, respiratory system, and per abdominal examination were normal. And on local examination, this smooth, dark red colored mass was protruding out of introitus, as you see on the image here, with a pale, firm mass suggestive of fibroid polyp around 5 to 3 centimeter size, which was attached to the base. It was bleeding on touch at places, and it was not reducible. Her baseline investigations were normal, and she was admitted with a hemoglobin of 8.7. These are the pre-op investigations. And on the MRI, her ultrasound was inconclusive. MRI findings, as you see here, suggested that the uterus is not visualized in the pelvis, with the uterus-like soft tissue mass, which was protruding through the vagina to exterior with stretching of lateral adnexa, as you can appreciate, if you can appreciate, and both the ovaries were seen posterior to the bladder. Part of the bladder was also protruding, possibly cystocele noted anteriorly with no evidence of rectocele. And above findings suggested uterine prolapse with possible uterine inversion and cystocele formation. On the basis of her history, clinical examination, and imaging, a diagnosis of chronic uterine inversion with submucous myoma was made. And she was counseled regarding surgical management. As she was not willing for any conservative uterine surgery, so a decision for laparoscopic hysterectomy was made after informed consent. So now I will hand over to Dr. Punita now to go through the surgical details.
Good afternoon, everyone. You will see the video. You can see that cervical ring out there. Can you appreciate that? Yeah,
Yes,
so these are the tubes and the ovaries, and that's the influx of all the flower vase appearance, so to say, the copybook flower vase appearance. And this is the left ovary, right ovary, and that's the ring. Can you appreciate that? There was a right ovarian cyst. We just wanted it out of the way, and since she was 40 and we were leaving the ovaries, I just did a quick cystectomy and sent this for histopathology and proceeded with injection of vasopressin into the area so that we have minimal bleed. I didn't want to touch the uterines at the origin. That was not required really. 10 units in 100 cc normal saline, and that's the ring. There is a bit of edema because of the chronic inversion, And then I used harmonic to incise the ring. I used the posterior approach because in anterior approach, you need to dissect down the bladder. Although she was no previous further surgeries, but I didn't want to take a chance of damaging the bladder. So I took a posterior approach and incise the complete ring. The idea is to relax the ring so as to be able to evert the uterus out. So that's further incision. Basic idea here, the trick is to completely incise the ring. The moment you incise the ring, you see, you feel a give way and you are able to lift out the organs which have prolapsed down. This was difficult here because of that big fibroid polyp that you'd seen hanging out in the previous pre-op picture. And that's the fibroid. That's the fibroid. These are the tubes, and this is the fibroid which was ulcerating outside. Here I am incising the base, and since we've used vasopressin, there is hardly any bleed. Of course, we are using harmonic as an energy source, but things can be pretty vicious and friable because of the chronic inversion. And that's the entire thing. Since the counseling was done and she was not ready for a conservative surgery, we opted for a hysterectomy. We reposited the entire organ tissue system so as to have a better anatomical outlook. And then we proceeded with the hysterectomy. This is the UV fold. We incise the UV fold. I use minimal energy and I use scissors for direct dissection. That's the bladder going down. And that's the last bit, which is being released. We could not use a uterine manipulator because of the position of the uterus, and we did it without the manipulation. A lot of people do that. I use ligation, number 1 Vicryl for uterine artery ligation. This is the left side, and I use number 1 Vicryl like you do in open surgery. Again, I transfix the uterine so as to copy the abdominal ways. A lot of surgeries in this case are done abdominally. In fact, they report about 48.8% are approached abdominally. A combined approach is seen in 27.7%, and very few people are still doing laparoscopically. So this is one of those laparoscopic approaches. Here the UV fold, the cervicovaginal junction is incised. This is the uterus, which is delivered out from down below. We had a wide vaginal opening. And of course, for the current, we removed the tubes. Salpingectomy was done. We had to support the vault. This is the uterosacral. This is the uterosacral stitch and the supporting stitch. You see how lax the uterosacrals are. So I took the number 1 Vicryl and we anchored the angle along with the uterosacral so as to tighten the vault. The vault is usually broadly open because of the incision of the constriction ring, and that has to be brought in position so as to prevent any prolapses in the future. Moreover, she's been anemic off and on, and she's had a lot of blood transfusion, so the tissues are not very healthy in the sense that the laxity is there. So what I did was, instead of compromising the vagina, I did a vertical suturing so as not to narrow the vagina, but also not allow the laxity of the vagina. We used a continuous stitch in the front, and then we use interrupted sutures like we do in closure of the vault. That's how the picture looked like at the end. Dr. Mamta, please.
Next. So total laparoscopic hysterectomy with bilateral salpingectomy has been performed in this case with right ovarian cystectomy. And this is the post-op image wherein you can very beautifully appreciate everything drawn in as if everything has been normal when you had already seen how it was pre-operatively. Post-op recovery was uneventful. 2 units blood transfusion was given to her in view of her baseline hemoglobin, not the blood loss was excessive per-operatively. Catheter removal after 48 hours and injectable antibiotics were given total for 72 hours, 24 hours pre-op and 48 hours later, and she was discharged on 3rd post-op day in stable condition. Tissue submitted as endomyometrium showed a lot of extensive ulceration with features of squamous metaplasia. Pathologist took a bit more time to report this specimen. And with the evidence of chronic cervicitis, bilateral tubes were unremarkable, and the polypoidal tissue suggested that it is leiomyoma, and cyst was suggestive of corpus luteum cyst. So coming down to the discussion, uterine inversion we know is rare entity with the incidence of around 1 in 15,000 deliveries. Most of these inversions are purpural, and non-purpural inversions account for further only 16% of all inversion cases. And the conditions which are commonly associated with non-purpural inversions are commonly being submucous myoma, followed by endometrial polyps, neoplasms like leiomyosarcoma, endometrial carcinoma, and very rarely rhabdomyosarcoma. As far as the stages of uterine inversion goes, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, as in prolapse, stage 1 is inversion of uterus is intrauterine or incomplete. Fundus remains within the cavity. Complete inversion, wherein the uterine fundus protrudes through the ring of the cervix. Total inversion, whereby the fundus protrudes through the vulva. This was a case of total inversion. And there is one more stage 4, where the vagina is also involved with complete inversion. So the diagnosis is essentially with high index of suspicion based on the symptomatology like severe dragging pain, retention of urine and all, if it is acute manifestation, but there can be subtle manifestation like in this case. Definitely a careful bimanual vaginal examination can clinch the diagnosis. That is a tight cervical ring around the mass on vaginal examination, the inability to pass a finger or uterine sound in between the cervix and the mass, and the non-palpable uterine fundus on bimanual examination. Ultrasound definitely may reveal a hyperechoic mass coming out in the vagina with a central, either a hypoechoic H-shaped uterine cavity and or on longitudinal image, a U-shaped depressed groove, which can be observed from the fundus in the center. MRI defines it better, a U-shaped uterine cavity suggestive of thickened and inverted uterine fundus along with ovaries at the top of U, which is indicative of uterine inversion, and a bull's eye configuration or target sign, as in this case, also suggests inversion. Management is essentially surgical, be it acute or chronic non-purpural inversion uterus, which can be via abdominal, vaginal, or laparoscopic routes. Several methods have been described in literature: Huntington's, Halton's, Spinell's, and Cusser's operation and all. And usually the abdominal methods, as told by Dr. Punita, are preferred because of the ease. The incision on the uterus is minimum, and the traction on the round ligament and the broad ligament is more regulated and may enable a better suturing and therefore a better hemorrhage control over the vaginal methods. This is a review of surgical methods, surgical management of non-purpural uterine inversion, which was published in an article by Herath et al. In Obstetrics and Gynecology International Journal 2020, which is quite latest, wherein they analyze about 133 cases. And as you see here, the approach to the surgery was abdominal in around 48.8%, vaginal in 18%, and combined abdominal vaginal in 27%. And laparoscopy was considered only in 6% of the cases. As far as the succeeded method of reposition was seen, it was unsuccessful and not attempted in around 52%. And Halton's procedure was successful in around 18%, followed by around in 25% of the cases other procedure like Spinelli, Huntington, Cusser, bisecting the uterus, reposition and all. And as far as the final outcome of the surgery was total abdominal hysterectomy, subtotal hysterectomy, it was performed in around 40%, vaginal debulking with the abdominal hysterectomy in 15.8%, vaginal hysterectomy without debulking in around 20%, radical hysterectomy in 6 to 7%, and only in 1.5%, that is in 2 cases when the article was published in 2018, submitted and published in 2020, only in 2 cases, in 1.5% of the cases, laparotomy oblique laparoscopic assisted vaginal hysterectomy has been performed, wherein the vault was sutured vaginally to correct the inversion of the uterus where hysterectomy was considered. So this is a review again from the article. They devised a treatment algorithm of non-purpural uterine inversion, wherein they say that when a diagnosis of inversion of the uterus is suspected, you need an ultrasound and MRI to confirm the diagnosis. If the malignancy is unlikely and the diagnosis of non-purpural uterine inversion is certain with benign etiology, and the patient has no fertility wishes, can attempt a reposition and followed by hysterectomy. However, if the patient has wishes to retain the fertility, attempt to reposition should be made, but if unsuccessful, the hysterectomy can be considered. you definitely need a diagnosis, which could be if the diagnosis of non-purpural uterine inversion is uncertain, because sometimes the ultrasound and MRI may not be very conclusive. So is your clinical examination, but definitely before contemplating any surgical method, you need a diagnosis in hand. And for that, either the biopsy of the lesion or a diagnostic laparoscopy, which may plan at the time of definitive surgery. We will not be now talking about malignancy. If it is suspected, that is altogether a different issue and a different approach, and needs a multidisciplinary team inputs to define. So at the end, I conclude by saying that in the era of minimal invasive surgery, the laparoscopic method is preferred due to minimal incision, less blood loss, faster recovery, less pain, but it should be done by experienced surgeons because the altered anatomy may pose challenges. And the clinician, depending on the causative pathology, clinical presentation, desire for future fertility of the patient, and surgical expertise, should select the best surgical approach. Thank you. And this is my acknowledgement to this review article on non-purpural uterine inversion, but the gynecologists need to know, by Heroth et al., published in 2020. And thank you for the patient hearing. I now invite the next speaker, Dr. Sharmishta, to present her next case. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Let's start with the second case. So this lady, 34-year-old, Rh positive woman, second gravida, previous one abortion, with 35 weeks period of gestation, with dichorionic diamniotic twins, presented for her antenatal care.
I can't see your slides. Your slides. Can't see your slides.
Can't see the slides. Oh,
No.
oh, sorry. Sure. 34-year-old lady, second gravida, previous one abortion, with 35 weeks of pregnancy, with dichorionic diamniotic twin pregnancy. She came for antenatal checkup. It was a spontaneous conception. Previous cycles were completely regular. According to her LMP, she was 35 weeks by Negri's formula. By going by her family history, her father had diabetes and heart disease, and mother, she died because of CS cervix. And she was a diagnosed case of polycystic ovarian disease. So she was married for 6 years. Previous one was a missed abortion that she was managed medically 4 years back, followed by 4 to 5 cycles of intrauterine insemination, all failed. And the last cycle was about an year back before her conception. And for that 1 year, she didn't take any ovulation induction drugs. No IVF were done during that. And this was a natural spontaneous conception, this pregnancy. So the first trimester, she was diagnosed with DCTA twins at 7 weeks. Bilateral ovaries were polycystic, and this patient continued to have morning sickness. The first trimester screen was normal. And she was diagnosed with gestational hypothyroidism and was started on 37.5 macrogram Thyronol. Second trimester, patient was diagnosed, she continued to have itching in palms and soles, and was diagnosed to have cholestasis of pregnancy and started on Hudilip, 300 milligrams twice daily. And her relatives also noticed that she is developing hoarseness of voice, and she is developing new facial hair and acne at around 26 weeks. So I'll just make you hear the voice note of this patient. Exit. So see the kind of hoarseness she had. This was in the antenatal period. So the third trimester, patient was admitted at 32 weeks. She had complaint of pain abdomen with a short cervix. So in view of threatened preterm labor, she was given steroid cover for lung maturity. So she got an ultrasound at 34 weeks, which showed fused placenta in the anterior upper segment, like it was adequate. No gross congenital anomalies, Doppler flows were normal. Now, the radiologist noted that the bilateral ovaries are enlarged. So right ovary was about 12 by 7 centimeter, left ovary was 14 by 6.9. And there were multiple enlarged thin-walled cysts of about 4 by 3 centimeter in the left ovary. And both ovaries had more than 10 locules with thick septa and anechoic cyst fluid. And the diagnosis of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome was given on ultrasound. So this is the typical spoke wheel pattern. We can see there is solid tissue in between. Around it, there are thin walled loculi of around 10 to 12 loculi in each ovary. So on a routine antenatal investigation, on the bile acid was 21, which was raised. Rest all investigations were within normal limits. So this patient was again admitted at 35 weeks. Emergency cesarean was done for DCDA twins, as first was a breech presentation, and she had came with liver pains. So the first one was a female baby, 2.1 kg, and second one was a male, 2.1 kg. So they both are alive, healthy. So this is the pre-op, per-op finding which I would like to share. Bilateral ovaries were enlarged with multiple small loculi with thin septas, typical of bilateral theca lutein cyst or hyperreaction luteinalis. Or during the postpartum workup, that all workups were fine except for the DHES, which was 63, which was a little on the higher side. Serum hormone binding globulin, if we see, were in the normal range on postnatal day 10, and again it was repeated around 42. They both were in the normal range. Total testosterone, if we see, that was the first testosterone we got on the post-op day 3. So that was 1,972, and which started decreasing gradually. So by day 42, it decreased to 46.8. Now this is the voice note of that female during the post. See, there is a shrillness of voice.
We can't hear Sharmishta voice note.
Oh, sorry, ma'am. We'll just play it again. Maximum.
We can hear the shrillness. We can't make out what she's saying.
Oh. So there's marked shrillness in her voice, ma'am. This is what I'm trying to say. When the testosterone started decreasing, her voice became shrill. There was a marked hoarseness of voice when we recorded the same lines. She was rhyming the poem Johnny Johnny Yes Papa. So when we recorded her in the prenatal period, there was a marked hoarseness, and now the shrillness has come when the testosterone started decreasing. Now on day 15 of her postpartum period, we again got an ultrasound. So this time they showed that the right and left ovaries both are about 373 ml and the 249 ml. So both ovaries were grossly bulky with multiple cysts of varying size scattered in peripheries. So the similar picture we get on day 15. Again, after 6 weeks of postpartum, we can see there's a remarkable decrease in the size of both ovaries. The right ovary is about 74 ml, left ovary has reduced now to 142 ml. So this is the picture after 6 weeks of postpartum. Now this is about after 3.5-4 months of a delivery, when the patient came for a follow-up in the OPD, we found that both ovaries have remarkably decreased in size. The right ovary was about 35 ml and left ovary was about 57 ml. But this time we couldn't record the pictures, but there was a remarkable decrease in the size of the both ovaries. So now for the discussion, I would like to call Dr. Geeta to give her expert comments on that.
Thank you, Sharmishta. I have a video a voice recording. I'm just playing it.
Eating sugar, no papa. Telling a lie, no papa. Open your mouth, ha ha ha.
This was the recording sent to me by the patient. This is 3 months after the delivery. And I think which you couldn't hear, what she was saying was Johnny, Johnny, yes, papa. And if you can just hear this one.
Johnny, Johnny, yes, papa. Eating sugar, no.
So this was the very hoarse voice just after the day of the delivery. So thank you, Dr. Sharmishta. And I would just like to take 2-3 minutes and inform about this interesting case. It is hyperreaction luteinalis. It is a very rare, though it's a very benign condition, which is what I want to convey through this case presentation. It is a benign condition. And usually it is seen in the 3rd trimester. And it is triggered by very high endogenous or exogenous beta-HCG stimulation. And in response to that, there is significant ovarian enlargement. And we can see bilateral theca lutein cysts in these females with mostly molar pregnancy. Almost 50% of women will show bilateral theca lutein cysts. 10 to 22% of trophoblastic will present with this, and choreo nearly 10%. Also, it is seen in pregnancies with large placentae, like multiple pregnancy, as in our case, or Rh sensitized pregnancies. It is also seen in PCOD, like our case was a known case of PCOD, because of the stroma of the ovaries, the echogenic stroma of the PCOS. It's very highly sensitive to even normal amounts of beta-HCG. Other associations are diabetes and ovulation induction. Next. So etiology is basically two. Either there is a genetic predisposition in certain women where there is a normal HCG value, normal HCG levels in their blood, but there is an abnormal sensitivity of the HCG receptor due to some gene mutation, and that can lead to an HL in a spontaneous singleton pregnancy. And the second etiology which has been propounded is that because of the high, of course, levels of HCG, as I've already told you in all these conditions. Next. So HCG, just to inform, everybody knows it is involved in the cytotrophoblastic differentiation and also propagation of angiogenesis in uterine vessels. It's also involved in fetal growth and organ formation through its role in testosterone metabolism. So if there is any high HCG levels, it can, because of these 1, 2, 3 involvements, lead to thereby congenital anomalies, angiogenesis defected, so there is preeclampsia 19% and growth affected in IUGR in 32% of cases, and abnormal genital development. So coming to the review of literature, there was a 2015 publication where Malinowski et al. Conducted the largest review to date of HL in the English literature, and they drew on cases from PubMed between 1993 and 2014, and they had about 58 pregnancies, of which 81% were singleton, and about 19 were twins, like in our case, they were twins. 93% were spontaneously conceived like our pregnancy, and 66% were in primies, and 93% was spontaneous conception as in our patient. Maternal virilization was seen in 29% of these cases like our patient, and fetal virilization was seen in only 3.5% cases. Elevated testosterone was noted in a vast majority, almost 84% of these women. Beta HCG was 68%, but as I told you, you need not have a high beta HCG. Even a high sensitivity to a normal beta HCG can also cause this condition. The comorbidities noted were PCOS in 6.9%, hypothyroid in 3.4%, like these two conditions were in our patient also, hyperthyroid in 8.6%. Adverse events like preeclampsia and GDM were seen in 19% and 5% respectively. Surgery. Now, how many patients out of these 58? 36% of women had surgery. Out of these 36%, about 23% underwent some acute complication like torsion or hemorrhage, while 76% were suspected of malignancy and lost their ovaries. Fetal anomalies were seen in 3.4%, preterm deliveries in 37%, like in our patient, she was a twins, went into labor. And average age at delivery was 35, like in our case also, it was 35 weeks, IUGR 31%. Mode of delivery was 50-50 vaginal cesarean, sex 50, female 70%, males 26%, early losses were 4%. Next. So symptoms of hyperemesis gravidarum and hyperthyroidism have been reported. And as it is, I've already told you, they are not related to the hyperreactio lutinalis actually, but it is provoked by the underlying problem that is causing the high beta HCG level, whether it be the trophoblastic disease or the multiple pregnancy. So that is one thing we have to remember, is that the HL which leads to it. And the prognosis of this benign condition is good. It is what the message I am going to give in this lecture. And in the postpartum period, these theca lutein cysts usually regress spontaneously. Now, physiologic underpinnings of virilization. We know virilization happens in about 25% of affected pregnancies. And in the study which I have quoted, maternal virilization was seen in 30% in the form of hirsutism, acne, temporal balding, clitoromegaly, deepening of the voice, like our patient had. Female fetal virilization does occur if hyperandrogenism occurs between 7 to 12 weeks of gestation, because at that time, the labioscrotal fusion takes place because of the testosterone, and clitoral hypertrophy takes place. But if a female fetus is exposed to high levels of androgen after 12 weeks, then she will not be virilized. Next. Just a small mention about the difference between HL and OHSS. HL is usually seen in molar pregnancies with predisposed by PCOS, diabetes, usually seen in second and third trimester. It is less acute, indolent course, and maternal virilization is common, as against OHSS, which is exclusively associated with ovulation induction in the luteal phase, seen in first trimester, early first trimester. It's very acute. There is significant fluid and electrolyte imbalance, ascites, hypovolemia, thrombosis, and virilization is rare. Now, approach to management. As per the reference of Malikoski, they have said that they have managed 64% conservatively, 36 were managed surgically. Now, out of these 36%, as I've already told you, 23% of the women presented with pain or torsion or hemoperitoneum and had managed surgically, and 76% because of suspicion of malignancy had their ovaries removed. So very important point is that enhanced knowledge of the characteristics and evolution of HL and availability of reliable ultrasound should allow clinicians to make the diagnosis with confidence and avoid unnecessary surgical treatment, which should be reserved only for acute complications like rupture, torsion, hemorrhage, etc. Now, coming to our knowledge enhancement, now as you can see, as Sharmishta has also shown you in the diagram, that they are usually bilateral ovarian masses. They are very large, usually more than 9 to 10 centimeters. They have a spoke wheel appearance and very thin walled theca lutensis of varying sizes. And some of the locules are small and large, and you can see solid tissue in between. As against the mucinous tumors, which are totally different look, and the color score is totally different, and you can make it out by your ultrasound criteria. Next. In pathology, if you see these slides, there is hypertrophy and luteinization of the granulosa and the theca interna layers. Next. Now, mode of delivery, as per the literature, there is no HL specific contraindication to vaginal, rather vaginal is preferred. Unless, of course, these enlarged ovaries may cause obstruction, in which case you might resort to cesarean section. Another very important concept is the inhibition of lactation. This is important. We have to remember that there is inhibitory effects of beta-HCG and androgens on lactation. Almost 30 to 35-day delay is noted in lactation, and testosterone levels of approximately 300 nanogram per deciliter or less is required. Our patient had 1974 nanogram in the day after the delivery. So that was a very high level, and she had this problem of lactation. So delayed lactation is very important. So involvement of a lactation consultant, nipple stimulation strategies are essential components of postpartum management of these patients. And as I said, our patient had transient delayed lactation and milk supply. So to conclude, patients presenting after the first trimester of pregnancy, mind you, after the first trimester, with bilateral multicystic ovaries with a classic spoke wheel appearance, hyperandrogenism features, clinical and biochemical, and you can have an abnormal high elevated beta-HCG, or you may have a normal beta-HCG also, with should prompt a diagnosis of HL. And you must know that the natural history of this condition is very benign. Target conservative management, minimize unnecessary iatrogenic harm to the ovaries, and monitor closely with ultrasound, both antepartum and postpartum, to ensure return to normal ovarian architecture, as is seen in our patient. Thank you so much. I now invite Dr. Renuka to present her case on misplaced IUCD. Thank you.
Section. Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to present a short case report, and the title is Misplaced IUCD in Urinary Bladder, a Clinical Rarity. To begin with, a 34-year-old woman, para 2L2, presented to our outpatient department with the complaints of burning, micturition, and occasional blood in urine since 1.5 months. There was no other complaints of discharge per vaginum, lower pain abdomen, urinary frequency, or any other menstrual irregularities. She had a history of postpartum IUCD insertion during cesarean section around 5 years back. Post-insertion, she never failed the property check, and there was no history of regular OPD visits for IUCD follow-up. While examining her, vitals were stable, and per abdominal examination was normal. On PS examination, no string was seen, and cervix was normal looking. On vaginal examination, uterus was antevertic, normal size, and fornices were clear. Then she gave us one ultrasound report, which was already done from outside by herself, and it showed displaced IUCD and piercing anterior myometrium with its lower end piercing the bladder wall and reaching the bladder lumen. These two are the ultrasound films. Though they are not very clear, I will try to explain you. This picture one is showing this part is whole uterus. And this is the dimension of the uterus they are taking. And these two dots, and this is the short limb. So this was the horizontal limb of the property. And then in the second picture, this is more clear. This black part is the whole urinary bladder. And we can see this limb, vertical limb of the property entering into the urinary bladder. So the diagnosis of misplaced IUCD penetrating the urinary bladder was made, and she was planned for hysteroscopy, cystoscopy, and laparoscopy if required. After PAC consent and routine investigations, she underwent the procedure. We first did the hysteroscopy. In hysteroscopy, uterine cavity was normal and horizontal limb was visible in the endometrial cavity. Vertical limb was penetrating the myometrium. We tried to remove it with the artery forceps, but it did not budge. So next we did cystoscopy, and cystoscopy was done by the urologist. In the cystoscopy, vertical limb was visualized penetrating the bladder mucosa. The limb was removed with the help of digitocentrifugal forceps, and the perforating mucosa was fulgurated using Bugbee electrode, and then Foley's catheter was inserted. This is the cystoscopic film. As we all can see, this vertical limb of property was invading the bladder mucosa, and it was entering the lumen of the bladder. So post-operative period was uneventful. She was discharged after 24 hours of hospital stay. After 3 weeks, urologist called her for a micturition cystoscopy, and on MCU, the bladder integrity was well maintained. So they removed the catheter, and she was discharged after urine. So in short, it was a case of misplaced IUCD penetrating the urinary bladder, and we managed it very well cystoscopically without any complications. Coming on to the discussion part, intrauterine contraceptive device is an effective, safe, and economic reversible method of contraception, and with a failure rate of around 0.5 to 1 per 1,000 cases, around approx 14% women they are using it worldwide. Post-insertion, few complications are seen, such as pelvic pain, abdominal uterine bleeding, pelvic infections, and rare complications are perforation and migration into adjacent organs. As I told you, routine perforation, they are rare complication of IUCD insertion with the incidence of 1 in 1,000 insertion. Very rarely a device may perforate and they can enter into bowel or urinary bladder. What is the exact mechanism? It is not very clear. Some few hypotheses have been postulated, and most commonly accepted theory is that spontaneous perforation of uterus occur due to physiological uterine contractions, especially during postpartum phase when uterus is undergoing involution and there is low estrogen level and tearing of the uterine muscle wall. The perforations can be primary, which commonly occur at the time of insertion because of the faulty techniques, and they are very painful. And the secondary perforations, it occurs usually due to gradual pressure necrosis of the uterine wall. The women who are at a high risk of perforation, they are lactating mothers, previous history of uterine surgeries, recurrent abortions, DNCs. We can also classify IUCD perforation according to the anatomical position. It can be partial perforation when they are mostly lying in the myometrium, and complete when they crosses all 3 layers of the uterus. This is a beautiful picture I have taken from Sam Rawlings' article. This is the partial we can subdivide the partial perforation into different categories. This is type A, in which most of the part lies in the uterine cavity and some part penetrate the myometrium. They are very easily removed hysteroscopically because most of the part lying in the cavity. Then type B, when the IUCD lies in the whole myometrium. They are very difficult to remove because we can't remove it hysteroscopically, They are laparotomy is usually required to remove them. Then type C, when they are mostly in the peritoneal cavity, but some part is still in the myometrium. Then we have type D, in which they invade the property that the IUCD lies in all 3 layers of the uterus. In our type, we can classify it in D1, but it should be the inverse of D1 because in our case, horizontal limb was lying in the uterine cavity, and this vertical limb was penetrating the urinary bladder.
So once they perforate, they usually remain 80% cases. In 80% cases, they remain in the peritoneal cavity, and rest of the cases they can migrate and they can penetrate various organs such as omentum, rectosigmoid, colon, appendix, urinary bladder, small bowel, iliac vein, or even perineal structures. How to diagnose them? They are very difficult to diagnose because they are usually asymptomatic. They have delayed presentation. The longest interval that we have seen in literature is 43 years. So they are very difficult to diagnose. Few patients might present with the missing thread, and few patients they have pain lower abdomen, UTI, and hematuria. Some cases they present with calculus formation also around the IUCD. It is due to the enzyme liberated by the Copperty device. So the diagnosis requires high clinical suspicion. If a woman presented with missing thread, the diagnosis of misplaced IUCD should be kept in her mind. X-rays and ultrasound, they are usually used to diagnose them. X-rays, exact location is difficult to diagnose, so ultrasound is the best modality. It should be removed as soon as it is diagnosed because of the complications and injury symptoms it is associated with. Cystoscopy is the best modality to remove it. In some cases, laparoscopy and even laparotomy is also required. Coming on to the review of literature, according to Sam Rollins' article, more than 70 cases of perforation involving the urinary bladder have been reported in the literature till now. After it, there can be few sporadic cases. Here in the next slide, I'm going to present few very interesting and unique cases of misplaced IUCD in urinary bladder. So in Noria et al. Reported a case series of 6 cases describing migrated IUCD in the bladder. In all these cases were found to have intravesical IUCD along the bladder stone. They all removed cystoscopically and without any complication. Then second case is a very unique case in which a woman had cystocele and rectocele, and for it surgery was cystocele rectocele repair was done. Then she had hematuria, recurrent UTI for 4 years, and it was not responding to antibiotics. So ultrasound was done in which it showed the IUCD, misplaced IUCD in the bladder with stone formation. So they try cystoscopy as a first line of management, but no limb IUCD was seen in the cystoscopy. So they did the laparotomy and they remove a 2 centimeter of IUCD with calculus from the upper left part of the bladder along with the IUCD. Then Torres et al. They reported a case of 8 weeks pregnant woman with misplaced IUCD. The ultrasound was done for routine antenatal checkup, and IUCD was found in urinary bladder. They removed it cystoscopically. So cystoscopic removal is also very safe in antenatal period also. The last is a very interesting case in which patient had a cesarean section at 34 weeks of gestation for preterm prom and quericorio. On post-op day 5, patient had high-grade fever, chills, and abdominal collection, for which CCT was done, which revealed IUCD penetrating the lumen of the bladder, and there was no collection. Then they removed it so they first introduced the cystoscope, but as nothing was visible in the cystoscope, so laparotomy was done, and the IUCD was removed from serosal and muscular layer of urinary bladder. So to conclude, we can say every case of missing IUCD must be investigated carefully for uterine perforation. Women with unexplained persistent UTI symptoms can be a case of misplaced IUCD in urinary bladder. Any misplaced IUCD should be removed due to possibility of complications in the future. Proper training should be there for safe insertion. Patient should be counseled for regular follow-up after IUCD insertion. Cystoscopy is the ideal method to remove it, and laparotomy is sometimes required in few cases. Thank you so much. Now I request Dr. Kanika to start her case.
आप स्टॉप शेयरिंग कर लो।
हाँ मैं कर रही मैम।
Kanika ma'am, you can share.
Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes, yes, start.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would be presenting a case, a very rare event of torted endometrioma with a very large uterine fibroid at 54 years of age. So, this patient of mine, she was 54 years and 3 months old when she'd come to us, and perimenopausal lady, still having her periods, though irregular since 2 years, and they were very heavy, associated with severe dysmenorrhea. But recent event was an acute episode of pain lower abdomen, which was 15 days back, and since then this pain had been persisting, and she was having difficulty in micturition also. So otherwise there was no history of any fever, any unhealthy discharge per vaginum, no weight loss, no loss of appetite, no bowel complaints, though she had difficulty in micturition. And she was taking some treatment from a local physician, but there was no relief. In the menstrual history, her previous cycles were regular with mild dysmenorrhea, average flow, but for the past 2 years, cycles were delayed, heavy, and prolonged. So, and her LMP was 1st of November, 1st of October. She had come to us in November. In the obstetrical history, she was para 2, both normal deliveries. 24 years back was the last childbirth. Apart from anemia, there was no other significant history, and anemia was also recently diagnosed, and no significant family history also. In the examination, apart from pallor, the other general physical examination was normal. And on per abdomen examination, we could feel a very large mass, which was more towards the left side of the abdomen, firm, 28 to 30 week size. And there was another cystic mass felt on the right side, which was around 16 to 18 week size, which was absolutely, you could feel it's separate from the above mentioned mass. On per speculum, cervix was very high up, and it was reached with difficulty to take the paps. On the per vaginum bimanual examination, uterus appeared retroverted. It was deflected to the right. It was bulky with restricted mobility, and it appeared to be lying between the two above mentioned masses. In the investigations, her hemoglobin was low, 8 gram/person. Apart from that, rest was normal. The tumor markers were normal, except for CA-125, which was 53.8. So she had an ultrasound which was done in October, which was done for her irregular periods, not for the pain, in which the uterus appeared bulky. The endometrial thickness was increased 12 millimeter, and with cystic echogenic appearance. There was loss of endomyojunction, and a large fibroid was noted. They reported the fibroid in the cervical region, and no comment on endomyosis and all was given. Then when she came with the pain, when she had the pain, she got an MRI done from somewhere outside, which reported uterus bulky, multiple fibroids, largest being 43 into 43 millimeters, that was intramural, and a large subserous 12 into 9 centimeter with hyaline degeneration. Now this MRI, we got it reviewed at our hospital, the MRI department, and we found that there was an oblong hyperintense mass lesion, which was 13 into 7 centimeters in the pelvis. And it appeared to them as they were quite sure that it was a left TO mass for sure, with torsion for sure. And it appeared as a hematosalpinx or a pyosalpinx, or the least possibility was a benign mucinous cystadenoma. So now this patient was insisting on a laparoscopic management. She had been referred to me for laparoscopic surgery. So we counseled her that we would proceed with laparoscopy, and then depending upon the intraoperative findings, we would decide. In all perspectives, it appeared that it was a benign lesion, but yet considering her age, we were skeptical. So on per our findings, as usual, cervix was high placed, and the same findings were almost corroborated as in the OPD. UCL was 10 centimeters, a DNC was done, and the endometrium was sent for a frozen section, which reported as a benign endometrium. Then on laparoscopic findings, we saw the omentum was completely covering the mass. In fact, I would just show the video. We can see it in this. So here you can see the omentum was completely covering the it's not playing. Can I show it this way? The video didn't play that way. Is it clear, ma'am?
Oh, it's video showing, no?
So we can see the endometriotic spots all over the anterior abdominal wall and the pelvis and omentum. This omentum was covering the fibroid also, which we have separated from there. And then we can see this oblong mass in the pelvis, which is adherent to the anterior abdominal wall, the bladder, the omentum, and also the bowel. It was extending from the left IP ligament to the right. And then after we separated it completely, here we can see the epiploicae also of the intestines. So all these adhesions were there, and even the right adnexa was kind of adherent to it. So after separating all this, we noticed that this mass had totted around its pedicle, basically the tubovarin and the infundibulopelvic ligaments on the left side. And there were two twists noted. And here we can see the chocolate colored fluid coming out. So basically this is the huge fibroid. And this here, we can see the twist around the pedicle, which was 2 times. And this is the uterus. And then we could make out that the fibroid is arising from the anterolateral wall. And it's basically subserous, though a huge one. So just to make the picture clear, what we did was we transfixed this base of this fibroid, which is a broad base, but not that broad. So we transfixed it, and post that we cut the fibroid. So after this kind of decapitation of the fibroid, we had some space to work on. Otherwise it was actually coming in the field. So as you can see, this was easily removed with harmonic. And now we can appreciate the twist better. And this is the teomas, which is extending from the left side, which is actually the left teomas going on to the right side. So now we had some space to operate, and it was completely separated from all its attachments, which it had gained. And so it was basically, it appeared as though it was a hematosalpinx along with an endometriotic cyst forming a teomas. So what we did was we secured this pedicle along with the torsion, because there was no possibility of detorsion. And it had been almost 15 days since this episode had started. So we excised this after coagulating. And then we had the uterus to ourselves, and we could make out the anatomy clearly. And then they were put in the endobag to be removed later. And obviously she was 54 plus, so the ovaries had to be removed. So then we proceeded with the hysterectomy in the usual manner. We secure the uterine vessels. We take transfixing figure of 8 sutures just to sort of prevent the heat sink effect post the suturing. We see the ureteric peristalsis, just to ensure that there's no injury there. And here we have skeletonized the uterines, and we would be taking a transfixation sutures here. So post that, we coagulate and cut the pedicles, and the elevator had been attached, and we do the colpotomy. Through the colpotomy wound itself, opening itself, we remove this mass in an endobag. And here at the end of it, it appears very neat and clean, despite all these adhesions. So basically, in the post-op period, it was absolutely uneventful. She was given broad spectrum antibiotics, injectables, DVT prophylaxis was given, catheter was removed after 24 hours, and the patient was discharged after 48 hours of surgery. And she was comfortable, and post-op day 7, her staples were removed. In the histopathology, we found that she had an endometrial polyp also. The myometrium showed endodermiotic changes with leiomyomata. The cervix showed chronic cervicitis. Right ovary was unremarkable. Right fallopian tube had mild chronic salpingitis. The left teomas showed chronic inflammation with extensive stromal hemorrhage and hemorrhagic infarctive necrosis, secondary to torsion probably. The blood vessels had fibrosis within the impacted areas. There were hemosiderin latent macrophages noted, and some endometrial glands were seen. There was no granulomatous or neoplastic pathology which was seen. So if we see the incidence of endometriomas in the menopausal age group is between 2 to 5%, and they say that maximum is seen in ladies who are on some estrogen replacement therapy, which this lady was not. She was perimenopausal, though with a late menopause. Endometriomas, especially on the left side, and myomas are more common in the perimenopausal endometriosis than the postmenopausal endometriosis, according to Michelle et al. And the endometriomas, they may present with acute abdominal pain. However, adnexal torsion in these patients is rare. And this is less likely because there are usually accompanying adhesions. So the twist becomes less likely. Rare cases of adnexal torsion induced by an endometrioma have been reported. One case was the isolated torsion of fallopian tube endometrioma, which was reported by Turgut et al. And one case of torsion of endometrioma in early pregnancy was found by Dua et al. So, as such, in the menopausal age or the perimenopausal age, no cases of torsion have been reported. Because of the rarity of torsion induced by an endometrioma, the diagnosis and treatment, they become challenging. A typical medical history and thorough physical examination is the first approach to make to the diagnosis. Pelvic ultrasonography is the first-line diagnostic imaging test showing a decreased or absent Doppler flows, especially in favor of torsion. MRI with contrast is helpful in clinching the diagnosis of an endometrioma and to rule out the chances of any malignancy. These cases should preferably be managed using a minimally invasive approach, assuming an optimal surgical setting. As the pelvic anatomy can be very distorted and adhesions with the surrounding viscera are anticipated, such surgery should be performed by expert laparoscopic surgeons, or one should choose one's own preferred route as far as the patient safety is concerned. So these are the three references mainly through which I have gone through. And I had searched the PubMed and the UpToDate, but there were no other cases of fallopian endometrioma torsion reported so far. Thank you.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, now we are open for discussion.
Yes.
Questions, I mean, anyone?
So thank you, Dr. Kanwal. These were wonderful cases, and I think we can ask our judges to give their comments and take the question answers. So, Dr. Sunita Malik, madam.
Yeah, it was all the 4 cases are very good and very well presented. So I just wanted to ask the first speaker, Dr. Mamta, regarding this leiomyoma. It was an inversion with leiomyoma. What was the size of leiomyoma in your case?
5 by 3 centimeters fibroid. Submucous leiomyoma type 0.
Yeah, it was a small size actually. We have seen very big myomas, and then it's very difficult to reposit it with the leiomyoma intact. You have to do myomectomy first and then reposit and do further hysterectomy, whatever is needed. So
yeah, in that case, can I just add, in that case, you can, you don't need to reposit at that time. Just do a vaginal approach to remove the fibroid. And then if you try reposition, maybe it will work. People have done a vaginal hysterectomy and taken an abdominal approach, a combined abdominal-vaginal approach. They have removed the large myoma from down below, decapitated it, and then gone back abdominally and done the entire hysterectomy.
Yeah, if we had one case when we removed this, did myomectomy, vaginal myomectomy, and the uterus reposited on its own.
Yeah, that is, if you remove the cause, you know, it comes back. But I think in that case, you need to strengthen the uterosacrals or do a plication or the round ligament. Because, you know, the uterine ligaments are very, very lax. Even if you remove the cause, the prolonged suspension from down below does make them very lax. And they tend to bleed. Anemia is one of the causes of a lax tissue.
Yeah. For the second case, Sharmishta, so like big thecal lutein cysts are seen in many cases, Dr. Geeta, and it's not that rare to see, and in fact, we have seen them in second trimester itself. So
Right, ma'am.
that is there. The thing is to just to be you managed it very well because it was like conservatively managed. So most of the time, people end up doing surgery, thinking of it as
Exactly. That was the message we were trying to give, ma'am, that we should avoid unnecessary surgery because they give a look of solid cystic mass, and that too bilateral. So many people get confused that we are dealing with malignancy in pregnancy. So they'll end up having oophorectomies or laparoscopy in pregnancy. So that was the message we wanted to give with this case.
Yeah, so the MRI helps, in these cases to find out whether it's a benign or a malignant case. And did you do testosterone in antenatal period itself because she had this hoarseness of voice and hirsutism and acne and all? No, ma'am, we didn't
No.
do this thing because she was a hospital employee. And if you noted, this was at the peak of the COVID. This thing happened when we were all in Colmet Hospital and peak of the COVID. Though the values came late, we had sent 1974. It was sent just the day before delivery, and it took a long time to come because of the COVID. We were preoccupied with that. But you are right; it was almost 2,000 nanogram per deciliter. But when we got ultrasound, they kept saying PCO, hyperstimulation, because IUI 1 साल पहले हुआ था. So that sort of misled us, you can say. But once we opened, and as you can see, normally they are more than 10 centimeters, multiple spoke wheel appearance. Then we went back to the literature and then we correlated, ye to HL, it was not exactly a simple theca lutein, it was a hyperreactio. That is why they have coined this term hyperreactio luteinalis to differentiate it from the routine theca lutein cysts, which are not so big. But the main message, as Sharmishta said, and you also said, don't go and chop them off or take a biopsy. They will shrink. That's the main message we wanted to give.
For that, you need a very good radiologist, actually.
Yeah, that's very
true.
important.
In fact,
you might think of it as a stromal tumor also, sex cord stromal tumor also.
Ma'am,
That's
this
the
was
thing.
on a Sunday, this cesarean, and that picture you saw was taken by a nurse, and then there was a ha in the OT ki isko kya kare, aspirate kare, nikale kya kare. I said, then you just leave it behind, we will track it. Right now, this is not the time to make her a menopausal lady. And anyway, I'll get.
It was good for her.
Thank you, ma'am.
So would you like Sunita and Seema to comment on the other cases?
No, it was a good collection of very uncommon and interesting cases. So I have just few questions for Dr. Geeta only, because I mainly relate to the pregnancies only. So Dr. Geeta, what do you think that what could have prevented anything? What was in the history that like in future you would like to avoid such things in a case of PCOD? What was the disposal?
Yeah, as I said, Seema, that PCOD, that stroma is very ecogenic. And in one of my slides, I mentioned that PCOD women, their stroma are acutely sensitive to HCG. So even normal level of HCGs in certain genetically predisposed people. I told one of the etiology was a genetic predisposition where a normal HCG level translates into as if she's a very, very high HCG level. Now we have to, I mean, there's some genetic, I don't remember the genes.
You in the dual marker, triple marker, because, at times we get 10 mom HCG, 20 mom
HCG mom, then you look at the thing, but as Sharmishta said, her double marker was normal. And as I said, HL usually sets in the late second trimester.
Yeah, there are cases you put the first also.
Yes, so that will help you to differentiate कि भाई ये genetic problem है या HL isolated HL है. So this is one way, because it usually sets in this hyper reaction, and the ovaries going into a flurry. It happens little later. By the time your double marker is done, your blood sampling has been done. So that is one thing. And second thing is you can, always track the testosterone levels and the sex hormone. Now in our case, the sex hormone was normal. Normally the sex hormone binding globulin in these patients is deranged, leaving a lot of free testosterone in the blood. So in this case, it was normal, but usually the sex hormone binding globulin is very low. But in our case, it was normal. So these are the two things I would like to say. Late onset of this HCG's peak helps in differentiating an HL from a, and mistaking it for a double marker high and a Down syndrome. So that will help.
Okay. And what was the gender of these two children?
Yeah,
Like,
one boy, one girl, and it was
Any
not a
other
virilized.
information?
No, it was not a virilized female because all the ultrasounds were done in Rangaram, all normal. Last में इन्होंने बोला it is looking like a very over OHSS like picture, and in that Corona time the ultrasounds were also not being followed very critically, I should say. Because of, but then we had it in our mind, and then our hoarseness, her balding, she had very classic balding, so we did have some idea in our minds ki kuch to hai, but we were not very bothered about it. It would be probably solved because then we went back to the literature and we studied, and that helped us to just not remove the ovaries.
Any link with non-classic CH? Could you find non-classic CH?
No.
There's no link because they also
No.
present with PCOD kind, and
Yeah,
then probably they
Yeah,
would
not
have
HF.
transition. So,
No, Seema, not
There's
HF.
no link- no
HF
link
has
with
no,
the-
no.
So thank you, Dr. Geeta.
Very
So,
nice question. I didn't think
Yes.
about the CH.
These are all-
Yes, you got me there, but इतने दिनों से पढ़ रही हूँ, CH का कुछ नहीं मिला मेरे को.
No, because
PCOD मिला है, diabetes.
I enter into PCOD from CH only.
Yes,
So that's
yes.
only. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So Sunita, Dr. Sunita said.
Yes, ma'am. All four very interesting cases. Regarding the first case, the anesthesia is also very important because sometimes you struggle even after cutting the posterior ring. So could you please tell us what specific thing you asked the anesthetist to give?
Okay. Well, our anesthetists are very good, without
I know.
they relax the patient wonderfully. And we were using vasopressin. That also helps relaxation of the tissues. We injected vasopressin 10 units and 100 cc normal saline. Of course, after telling the anesthetist, you aspirate and you follow the precautions. And that's about it. So far, we've not had any problem as far as the constriction ring goes. I think you are talking more about the purpureal prolapses.
No.
Yeah,
I'm talking about this only. We have
No,
struggled
we-
sometimes, and when we ask them, it
Ah.
really works wonderfully.
We've not had any problems, personally speaking. We've done 2 cases. They are very rare. So 2 cases is also good enough. You tell us, what is your experience?
We asked them to give some good relaxant, and
Sevoflurane,
especially something like
Sevoflurane they use.
Yeah.
And we have no issues about relaxation. I don't know what you use routinely. For us, a routine is a very relaxed patient. So I don't.
Okay, we asked them for something special, and then I have seen even the posterior constriction ring. After that, everything just comes out. You have to struggle very little.
You tell us. I think we are using that routinely.
Okay, maybe.
And
I think this only, huh?
Yeah. So these we are using routinely without even having to ask them.
And regarding Dr. Geeta, your CA-125 levels and all, you did not mention. It was diagnosed very well clinically. Your radiologist was good and you had a good high index of suspicion, so you diagnosed it. But normally with such cases, especially when your radiologist is not that accurate, you are bound to do CA-125 levels and
actually in this case, CA-125 we didn't do because in pregnancy anyway it comes raised, so we were not able to interpret it in a more imaginable way. So and plus clinically she was very hyperandrogenic. Clinical hyperandrogenemia was quite evident. So our thought process was more towards HL.
CA-125 is not raised after second trimester. It's raised usually in the first trimester.
But sometimes you
So
may get,
normally-
because being twins, being twins. So
that may be
we
there.
were skeptical about interpreting it and then confusing the patient. She's a hospital employee. So, and plus we
I
had an
don't-
index of suspicion.
CA-125 may not be of much use.
Yeah.
It is used in literature.
No, but just for diagnosing of a
No, it's not for diagnosing this, but for ruling out
No,
any
ruling
kind
out
of
also it is
CS.
of no use. It is of no use.
It's really not of much benefit
Not at
actually.
all.
We had a clinical suspicion, clinical hunch.
The
Yes.
clinical suspicion was very good.
Yeah.
So regarding the
Thank you.
fourth case, anything you want to say, Sunita? The fourth case, Kanika, It was very well managed laparoscopically. I must say, I wouldn't have ventured doing this with such a big tumor, and it could have been malignant also. Like, did you never had those doubts about malignancy in this case?
We had those doubts, and that is the reason why we got the films and all re-evaluated at our setup. And there was nobody has reported any evidence of any mitotic activity. The tumor markers were all normal. And to us, it appeared it could be a teomas, maybe a hematosalpinx, which had totted. And maybe that is why she's presenting this way. And when we went in, there were no telltale signs. And even if it had been some borderline or some malignant potential, so whatever damage had to be done had been done. We wouldn't have done anything further with that because it had leaked or whatever. And there were radiations. So we wouldn't have done anything worse than that. So we tried with utmost gentleness to took it out in the endobag and all. That is the best we could do. Luckily,
Can I?
very rare to be reported as an endometrioma.
I think Dr. Kishore wants to say something. Yes, sir.
Regarding this case only, I mean, luckily, actually, there was no malignancy, but I have seen one case just like this, and but for that, PET was also done, and that was a doubtful thing, and therefore the frozen was arranged for such a case. Laparoscopically, it was started, frozen was arranged, and in frozen, it came out to be malignant, and therefore, and it was an endometrioma only. First,
No.
it was thought that it is just an endometrioma. So it is possible. It is not that it is not possible. One, I mean, there you should have a, you should, even a PET also should be done in such cases. This is my opinion. And I just want to just statement about the misplaced Copperty case. Most of the time, when it is a lactational uterus, one should never put a sound. I have seen many people putting sounds. So in a lactational uterus, you never put a sound so that there is no chance of perforation. Otherwise, you will find that most of the patient will have perforation. I mean, it will be gone unnoticed. And number two, one case, particular case, I remember about a misplaced Copperty in which ultrasound also said that it is in the pelvis or in the myometrium. But when on hysteroscopy, nothing came out. On laparoscopy also, I could not find anywhere. But still it was there. And फिर हमने उसका ऑर्थोपेडिक से लेके हमें दोबारा उसका एक्सरे कराया था वो what is it ultrasound भी कराया, but it was still there, so in the OT. And then it came out to be between under the serosa, I mean outside the myometrium and under the serosa, the whole thing was like that. And only one point was pointing out on one of the places. From there, we could find out, yes, then we made a cut in the serosa and it came out to be. So sometimes Copperties can be very, very tricky.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
That's true. We had one which was intramyometrial. We were trying to find out the interior
The
posterior.
intramyometrial
Everywhere we couldn't find it.
But this was neither in the myometrium.
The intramyometrial ones can even land up in a hysterectomy.
Yeah.
And one case I remember in LNJP hospital, everywhere, वो तो ultrasound वगैरह ज़्यादा उस time था नहीं. Nothing was found anywhere. And pelvis में X-ray में आ गया था कि it is there. And फिर जब कोई close was कर रहे थे तो पता नहीं anesthetist said just do a PR. And then a PR was done. And the Copperty, most of the Copperty was in the rectum.
So I think we are getting little late for the GBM. Dr.
Okay.
Achla has already shared the screen. So over to Madam.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you,
you.